Lovely, thank you. And without further ado, Kay and Jan.
Good evening. I'm so glad to see participants from so many congregations. We're just happily reading the list as it came in. I'm Jan Christian, and I've served as congregational life staff in the Pacific Western region for just over a year now. And in addition to serving as primary contact for about 20 congregations, I'm 3/4 time, my particular areas of interest are conflict transformation and stewardship. And before coming on to staff, I served our congregation in Ventura, California for 13 years. And prior to that, I worked for many years in and around Arizona's social service and justice systems and taught in the College of Public Programs at Arizona State University. And I live in Atascadero, California now, which is on the Central Coast, with my partner and 2 cats. And the one you might see tonight is Gracie. Kay?
Thanks, Jan. I'm Kay Kreider, and I've been working with nonprofits for 16 years on professional stewardship services. Wayne Clark, who authored Beyond Fundraising, recruited me to help with congregations funding their missions and visions and successful annual budget drives, financial feasibility studies, capital campaigns, and planned giving. And our consulting group, now that Wayne has retired, is called Stewardship for Us. One of my passions is to help our UU congregations build cultures of abundance and generosity so that we can make a difference in our lives and the wider world. I also teach in the graduate program at the University of Oregon's Business School. So our opening words tonight are from Robin Sharma, who's a Canadian writer, humanitarian, and leadership speaker. Change is hard at first, messy in the middle, and gorgeous at the end. Stewardship in general is a broad concept. A lot of times we associate stewardship just with finances, but it's really the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. So it's about everything that goes on at your congregation, the board work, the staff work, committee members, volunteers for an event. All the people who are giving their time and their talent and treasure are stewards of the congregation.
We live in a contract culture, and it gives us a very different mindset than a stewardship or a covenant culture. But the culture we seek in stewardship is one of these kinds of values and these characteristics. One of the values is that we are worthy as we are. Another is that we all bring gifts, and that when we share what we have everything that we need. And we also seek to practice generosity in all things. This is a value that congregational life staff carry with us. We all do, whether we're talking to a congregation about stewardship or transforming conflict or personnel issues, an attempt to practice generosity in all things. And that's part of the stewardship culture that we're going to be talking about. So we come to a central stewardship question. How do we nurture and grow what we have to build the common good and make our own days glad? Kay wanted me to sing that, but I'm going to spare you tonight. But some of you will recognize those words from our hymn, to build the common good and make our own days glad. And then we come to the stewardship mission. The issue is really using all the resources at our command to craft lives of meaning and purpose, and to understand stewardship as an all-year calling to a new way of life. So it's not just the pledge drive. What follows tonight are some really practical ways to achieve this culture and mission. And you may have more creative ideas and additional ideas, and we hope to hear some of those tonight. And Christopher has already given you some ideas about how you might share those. And in addition, we might call on one of you. You can always pass, but we will also be asking you to write in the chat from time to time.
All right, so let's go over our agenda for the evening. We have several topics that we want to cover. First one is getting comfortable talking about money. That's always something that causes concern, and people say that it's secret, so we'll talk about ways to move into that and talk about it more comfortably. Healthy access to pledge information. Who's allowed to know how much people are pledging and why is that important? Moving from a spreadsheet to a database. So small congregations often have an Excel spreadsheet, or they use QuickBooks or something like that. And we'll talk about how you can migrate to a database and why that might be helpful to you. The next item we'll talk about is educating the fellowship about range and distribution of pledges. It's important for people to know what the range and distribution is, just as a piece of information when they're making their own decision about how they want to live out their values. Keeping the personal stewardship connections as you grow. We're going to talk about ways to do that. Electronic giving options. These days there's lots of ways to give electronically, and we'll be mentioning several ways that you can think about that you might want to add to your giving portfolio. And then some online resources for the future is the last thing that we're going to cover. So let's get started with talking about money. So George Kinder has written a lot about giving, and he has a quote. He says, "When we enter this world, money has no meaning. As newborns, we live in a world defined by simple physical needs for food, warmth, and touch." I would argue that we still have those same needs as adults, but all of us know this innocent state of being, replete with honesty, directness, and wisdom. Yet at some point, this primal state breaks down because life draws us down its path. As we grow, we learn, and one of the realities we learn about is money. And as we learn about money, it can become difficult to talk about. It can be a sensitive topic. So why are we uncomfortable talking about money? It brings up a lot of emotions for people. So please list some negative emotions or concepts that people associate with money. If you could type that in the chat menu, or you can unmute yourself and think about why we might be uncomfortable talking about money from an emotional aspect. Somebody mentions jealousy, disparity, instability. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Some people use money to control, shame.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So all guilt.
Yeah.
So I'll list a few here that are on our slide, but all of the ones that you have in the chat. Inability to contribute. Absolutely. So stress and anxiety is also something people sometimes associate with money. Embarrassment, greed, judgment, scarcity. So these are things that can make us reluctant to talk about money. And we love to talk about sexuality and some other taboo topics. For example, in our Whole Lives sexuality curriculum, somehow money is off limits though, even though we have some positive ways to look at it. So if we identify the source of the negativity, sometimes we can work through that and recognize the stress points, and then think about how we can reframe that and look at money in a more positive light. So let's explore some positive emotions about money. So please list some positive things that you associate with money in the chat box. Growth and outreach. Ooh, boy, it's filling up. Growth and outreach, security, generosity, abundance, sharing, ability to donate, allows you to do things. Showing love. I love that one. No pun intended. Possibilities, security. These are all great. So sometimes people are happy, ecstatic, hopeful, relieved, empowered. What can they accomplish? Confident. Reverend Lisa Schwartz, one of our own, says that money is not neutral. It's a positive source, a positive good for humankind. So when we think about it in that way, and think about what it enables us to do as congregations for our own congregation and then in the wider community and the wider world, it can be a force for good.
So how we frame the money conversation can be really important. And we have a tendency sometimes to highlight the negative. And I think it's important. We talk in the Pacific Western region about culture shifts and reframes. And this first bullet point, to highlight the positive, to be able to say things, and we were already seeing some of it in the chat, here are some of the things we can accomplish with our generosity. Here are programs and ministries worth our support. To come from a place of abundance, that we're talking about a fully equipped vessel versus a sinking ship. And that generosity applies to all giving levels. I have really not known anyone who couldn't give something. Now, at the same time, I would say that half of generosity is the ability to receive. And we did have people in the congregation I served in Ventura who were pledging, and then we were financially supporting them in some ways. So, but there was still a reciprocity. There was a giving and a receiving, and people feeling that their gifts can be generous, and that generosity is not so much the amount as it is a generous use of resources that are there. So a sense of abundance and possibility are really important, and we focus on what is possible in the money conversation. So here's a giving guide, and everyone's probably rushing up to their computer to be able to read some of this. You're going to get a copy of the recording, and you can do that. And it's also, you can download this from the UUA. But one thing we find is we often leave people totally adrift about how much to give. We give them no guides at all about that. And we expect them to figure it out on their own. And Kay used this chart in a congregation once, and a woman was shocked to see it. But she changed her pledge from $250 a year to $250 a month once she saw it. This is a guide that does several things. It takes into account different income levels and different levels of commitment. Because as much as we would like to think that everyone has the same level of commitment to a congregation, they simply don't. And that's probably okay. And they certainly don't have the same resources. So this is a guide that takes that into account. And it also shows that generosity is not a dollar amount. So $20 a month may be as generous as $2,400 a month, depending on a person's level of resources. Again, this chart can be downloaded from the UUA website. And it's important, this brings up all kinds of feelings. And you know what, that's okay, because that's how we grow, right? Is we look at those feelings that Kay talked about, that we have those feelings and we don't just say, stop, that's not okay, I don't want to do this. We're able to be present to those in a loving and compassionate community so we can work through some of those. So, of course, we would say to be straightforward and compassionate in using the guide. So if you're using this, I invite you to type in the chat whether or not, that you are, if you are. And I will say this, if everyone in your congregation was on the guide and being honest about their level of commitment and their level of resources, you could fully fund your mission and vision.
And I'll just go back and let you look at the guide one more time now that Jan has talked about it. And think about, oftentimes I go to congregations and they've eliminated one or more of the columns on this. And that doesn't mean that one size fits all. You can modify the guide and have it represent what you feel like is going to work well for your congregation. But oftentimes the right-hand side is gone. People are nervous about asking for 10% because they feel like it's traditionally religious or as a tithe. And I would encourage you to include that giving category, because there are some people who are going to be able to do that. And again, as Jan said, of all economic levels. So it's not just about people who are giving a lot of money. The percentage and the economic justice component of this can let people at all giving levels be generous givers.
I see in the chat that Mallory says we've used it but decided against it last year. Many people don't like it. Some people feel it's forceful. And then we use a modified version would like to discuss. Is that something you'd like to comment on right now? We certainly understand the shying away. And that's probably our biggest challenge as Unitarian Universalism, as Unitarian Universalists, is our discomfort with talking about giving. And until our leaders do and can just sit in that space of discomfort and find ways for people to talk about the feelings that come up. There is actually a UUA curriculum on money, the Wisdom Path. That's sort of our whole lives for money. And that might be a great start in your congregation to have some of those conversations.
I noticed in the chat too that some people say they like to rename the columns and they prefer +1, +2. That's perfectly fine. I mean, you can customize the guide. Right. But giving people a guide really does, for some people, give an idea to some people who either haven't been to church before and they don't know what it takes. They assume church is free, or that there's some larger denominational fund that's funding to help pay for the minister or the building or whatever it is. And so giving people the opportunity to see what's possible, what they can do through this guide, and then asking people, say, I'm on the guide, can you join me on the guide? And again, I know people are uncomfortable sometimes asking other people for money, but you're not talking about particular amounts here when you're disclosing if you're on the guide or if you'd like everyone to get on the guide or have a goal to move towards getting on the guide.
Right.
It's really it's an economic justice tool that you can use. And generally, if you don't ask for people to step forward and support something, your donation amounts will be less if you don't give a compelling reason for and some guidelines about how they can give.
Right. And I'd like to, there are a few others here. We used it but didn't like it much. Sky Island, who's used it for several years, just started using it. Don't like the 10%. Use 11. If 10 has negative ideas, people have negative ideas about that in your congregation, you can certainly use more. And we've had people, certainly in Ventura, who gave more than 10%. So I think...
Jen, we had a question from ST2 Smith, who actually, I don't know who that is yet, but
okay.
I've unmuted them and turned their video back on.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, nope, her mic isn't on.
Okay.
Sorry, that's a...
Okay, maybe.
Later.
There we go.
We can hear
Now
you
we can
now.
hear you.
Okay. Go ahead.
Now I forgot what my question was. Well, one thing positive I could say was that we had a presentation about different religious traditions and how some, and I'm forgetting the specifics, but we had several. And one was 3%. Not everybody had been raised on the 10% that I was raised on, and so that right there was informative to people and a conversation starter. So that was good. I was surprised how strongly some people reacted to the labels that you use in that chart, which I thought were pretty. They didn't bother me, but people really felt strongly about this. So I guess I just wanted to throw that out. Is that just our congregation or what?
No. And what I was, thank you for that. And I would say we are so steeped in shame and guilt and tying up our sense of worth with money. And I think the people I see struggle the most around it are people like me, because this has been a huge area of struggle for me. Probably the most poignant area of my struggle, of my spiritual struggle, has been about a sense of abundance about money and scarcity about money. And I learned it as a child, and that's where we learned a lot of this. I find the people sometimes that struggle most are the people who have money to give and just can't bring themselves to do it, who would be able to give without even noticing a great difference in their life. Although we ask that, some people have said charitable giving should change your life. So you're not alone. And that's very prevalent. And I think part of it is setting a culture that generosity is a religious value, that it has many forms, that we realize sometimes people are really great at being generous about forgiveness and assuming the best and giving of their time, and they're just not there yet with money. But creating a culture in which we hope they will get there, and just walking alongside people in order to do that. So it's not just yours. There was something else that occurred to me on that too, which I forget right now, but we probably need to move along and maybe we'll get to it a little later. But thank you for that.
And I just wanted to comment real briefly on Mallory Rice. Her comment is, we used to have the labels on the pledge card itself to check, but we did away with that because it basically tells us what the individual's income is. So one thing you can do as an alternative is just have a box that says, yes, my pledge is on the Fair Share Giving Guide, or yes, this is a Fair Share pledge, or something like that. So it's not about which column you're in or which category you're in. It's an affirmative thing for people to look at and say, yes, I'm feeling good about that I've been working towards a Fair Share pledge. You can even have a box that says I'm working towards making a Fair Share pledge.
Right. I think the other part that I was thinking about there too is that most people don't know what percentage of their income they're giving. They've never done the math. And so that's a learning in itself. And we might get to that later too, but we probably need to move to the next slide. Thank you, all of you, for a rich discussion.
All right, access to pledge information. So this is definitely a sensitive area, so we're touching on several of these with the Fair Share Giving Guide and access to pledge information. So why do you think it might be good to have more than one person knowing the pledge information? And this is not something that you want to post on the blog or on the even the closed website access for the congregation, but why might it be good to have more than one person know what the pledging information is?
We keep going there, and maybe people will.
Okay.
Accountability.
Accountability. Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. So it's always, two heads are often better than one, or two checks and balances are often better than not having those. So, and one person says as a security measure. That's a great reason.
Yes, it is.
So, for example, in your congregation, if you have an administrator, and not everybody does have one that's a paid staff, but they often might know what the pledge amounts are. The treasurer often might know, or a pledge secretary might know, and perhaps other people might know as well. So one of the people that there's always a bit of controversy over, and I shouldn't say always, it depends on the congregation and it depends on the culture and what's happening there. People think, well, why should the minister know what people are pledging? And it's not that the minister is going to focus a lot on that, but what would be a benefit of a minister knowing what people pledge?
Well, let me answer that. First of all, I think it's always important to play to a minister's strengths, just as we play to congregational strengths. And ministers have very different perspectives on this. This topic really comes up because this is a webinar for small congregations, and we often see this dynamic more often in small congregations that have been lay-led for a long time, sometimes where there's been a breach of trust by the minister. They're just now being served by a minister. And also sometimes just because people don't feel good about their giving and they don't want any more people to know than would have to because they don't feel good about it. What the point we want to make in this webinar is that if ministers want to know, they should have access. For me, it was important in terms of pastoral care. It was important in terms of having a sense sometimes of a change in financial picture. When someone reduced their pledge or increased it, what was going on? Was that pastoral? Was that a financial change? The members, their feelings about the congregation? It I think engenders trust. I mentioned that when I first was going into the ministry, it was one of the topics that was particularly difficult for me. But I think for people to have those kinds of open relationships, we know the kind of time people are donating. Why is it that we put such a different sense on money? It's okay for us to lift up the amount of time people donate, and yet we're very uncomfortable about that when it comes to money. Again, these are just opportunities to look more at our attitudes about it. But we are really strongly emphasizing that if ministers want access to pledge information, that's an important thing for them to be able to have. And if there are trust issues around that, then that's a great opportunity to start that conversation in a meaningful way.
And sometimes the reduction in a pledge amount is the only little piece of information that the minister gets if they're informed about it, that there is a problem because the person hasn't come forward to talk about either their change in their financial circumstances or they've been hurt somehow and their pledge reflects their feelings towards the congregation. So having that ability, if the minister wants it, is, again, it can be a matter of pastoral care and trust. Another piece of who might have access to the pledge information is the stewardship chair and or stewardship team. So we want to think about secrecy versus confidentiality. So if the stewardship chair, the person or people who are running the annual budget drive or running a capital campaign don't have access to that, they're not going to be able to do as good of a job and as compassionate a job if they don't have access to the pledge information. So keeping that confidential, it's not that you want to publicize it, is important, but having it be secret so that the stewardship chair or the stewardship team does not have access to that can be a barrier to a successful campaign. They can be compassionate about it. They can know about circumstances. I've been in many, many conversations with my own congregation as well as other congregations about, well, how do we want to approach X? We know that they have some circumstances around this. Should we have Patty go do a visit, or should we make a call and suggest X? Having the stewardship team know the information about pledges can be very helpful, and keeping that in a database, as we will get to in a minute, can be an important tool to help them do their job. So if you're going to do a face-to-face stewardship campaign, which some congregations have done and some have not, that's a great way to do matchups for that. If you know what the pledges are and the stewardship chair can do those matchups. You can also do those face-to-face visits without knowing the pledge information, but sometimes there are special circumstances involved that it's good to be able to have that information so they can do the best job. So trust in your team. If they're willing to work on these issues and do it in a compassionate way, having them have access to that information is going to make your stewardship and financial fundraising more successful typically. All right, so moving from a spreadsheet to a database. So why change? Change is hard. As we said.
Kay, if I can interrupt for one moment, Ruth just asked if you could say more about that.
Okay, more about
certain circumstances.
That people might have about why it would be good to know. Well, so sometimes people have had a job loss, or they've had a large medical expense, or they have a splitting up with their partner, or whatever it is that causes a change in circumstance, and they might have a lot of stress in their life and be feeling very anxious about their finances. Right. So I think that for any kind of campaign, whether it's involving a letter, whether it's involving a personal visit, knowing about that can be helpful if someone's going to say, you know, we don't know what's happening with Ruth. We want to check in with them. So having that specific information can be helpful. And again, people can be very compassionate about that. I've not typically seen people take on a stewardship team in my own congregation or other congregations, take that information and use it in an unkind way. They've just used it to reach out in a compassionate way to folks when they're doing their fundraising.
And that's where often it can be, sometimes those are the kinds of tips to the minister. Sometimes it's the first time the minister might find out about it in a congregation in terms of those kinds of conversations. And inviting people, you know, I'm going to be talking to the minister about this and letting her know, you know, about this conversation, and then I could be in touch. So I think those are important things.
All right, so moving from a spreadsheet to a database, again, we said at the beginning that change can be messy, but it can be good at the end. So moving from a spreadsheet to a database can help you as you grow. So, having a database out there lets us have access to a lot more information that can be, you know, the financial piece is just one particular piece about it. So helping as you grow, and it can help you grow. So as you're growing, your database will help you have a repository of information that you wouldn't have that's just as part of a financial spreadsheet. And it can help you grow because then you'll have more information. You can reach out to folks by having a lot of different fields in your database that can contain information, again, about much more than just what their financial giving is. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel if you're going to move from a spreadsheet to a database. And I have examples here of Icon that they have a particular one for churches, Church Works, Church Database, etc. And there are discussions on UU listservs such as Church Management Software and UU Money. Those are listservs that you can access through this link that's on this slide. And that we'll have this as a resource tool at the end as well. So you'll get a copy of this. But you can get on a discussion. You can ask questions. We're looking at using Icon. Who's used this, and did you like it or did you not like it? We're using ChurchWorks. What do you think about it? Or we're having a problem with our ChurchWorks database and we want to do X. Does anybody have any advice on that? And usually on the listservs, I'm subscribed to several. There's always a lot of activity and people answering questions. So again, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. When you're thinking about moving from a spreadsheet to a database, a lot of congregations are using databases that they like, and they've used some that they don't like as well, and they'll tell you that on the listservs too. So you don't have to start from scratch. So do any of you use a database that you like? And if so, if you put that in the chat feature or unmute yourself and tell us what that is. So Ruth mentions that she used Icon at a former congregation and she didn't like it, but now she's using Breeze, which is cloud-based, and she loves it. And another participant says, we use Church Database. And do you like it? It seems clunky. Okay. All right. Mallory says we've started to build our own in Access, but I didn't think to include financial information. It was focused on membership info only. So having the information all together in one place makes it easy to access for a variety of people who might need access to the information. When I say access, just because you need access to one component for membership doesn't mean that you are going to have access to all the financial information. So some of the benefits can be for annual capital and planned gift tracking. So you have in there, what people are pledging. You can use that in your financial strategies. Databases are offered.
Okay, also, I'm sorry, Brian asked the question, would this totally take the place of a spreadsheet, of spreadsheet-based financials?
Well, so a database doesn't typically take the place of all of the spreadsheet financials, but a lot of smaller congregations just track their pledges, list their pledges in Excel. So the database is a way to have that pledge information in there, and payments and statements in particular are easily generated if you have a database that is working well for you. That'll show when you made your payment and what you have left to pay in your pledge for the year. Those statements can be automatically generated and save a lot of time. They can also be used to help you stay on track financially as a congregation. So sometimes people get behind on their payments or forget to make their payments. And then if you wait too long before they get a statement, if you'd only do those once a year, then that can be difficult for people to catch up on their pledge. So having, say, quarterly payments quarterly statements on the payments can be an effective tool. So somebody says when we switched to a database and started getting those statements, it was helpful. People appreciated getting semi-annual statements. So you can do them semi-annually, quarterly, whatever you think is going to work for you. But typically you're not going to, if you have a spreadsheet that's listing all the different expenses for your congregation, that's typically not something that you would necessarily put in a database, but the pledging information and lots of other information about members, their gifts, their committees, how they're involved, that can help a lot. So related to that, member involvement and leadership, membership history. And you can send out invitations, you can send out e-bulletins, you can send out electronic communications. So I know a congregation that had an event that they wanted to invite everyone to, and they figured out how through their database to pull that information and send out an email invitation to folks through their database. And that was much easier than the traditional methods that they had been using before. And they could actually tailor their particular invitation for particular events by doing a sort in their database. So other info can be helpful, having, who's got kids in RE, who's the partner of somebody. My husband and I do not have the same last name, so people who don't know us would not know that we're together. What are their preferences about a variety of things? You can have that in the database as well. So it allows you to better steward many areas of congregational life, not just the financial aspect of it.
Yes, one thing I would think of too is, when you put out questionnaires about who's willing to give someone a ride to a doctor's appointment, who's willing to take a meal. There are a number of things like that for pastoral care and caring committees that can be very helpful too. And if you sort by zip code and you can find someone in that person's area, it can be a streamlined way to do that.
Right, it allows you to sort for that, absolutely. So Harlan says that in many congregations there's a lack of tech support available to open source projects, and it's generally a barrier.
That's Christopher. That's Christopher answering a previous question from Harlan about databases. So I think we can let people read that. And thanks, Christopher, for replying to that.
Got it. Thank you. Sorry, I need to put my reading glasses on so I can see the other computer with the chat. Since I'm the one
you've got a lot going on.
Sharing the screen. I don't have the chat on my screen. It's off to the side. So
okay.
Thank you, Christopher. All right. So educating your congregation about your pledge distribution. So some of you may have seen the quartiles of giving, a pledge distribution. And when we call it quartiles of giving, we're dividing your pledge amount into 4 equal parts. So for example, just to take the round number of $100,000, then each quartile would have $25,000 in that quartile. So how many pledging households are giving in that first quartile to make up that first $25,000? And how many are in the second quartile to give the second $25,000? So those first 2 quartiles would be 50% of the pledging income in your congregation is in those first 2 quartiles. And then how many are in the third quartile? How many are in the fourth? So this chart is an actual representation of a UU fellowship and what their numbers are. And this is how many households are in each of the 4 quartiles. So for example, there are 57% in that fellowship of the congregation are giving 1/4 of the funds. And we don't expect this chart to have equal numbers of pledging households in each of the quartiles. That's unrealistic. We all know that there's a variety of economic circumstances. But how can we as congregations better fund our missions and our visions? We can look at this chart and say, gee, can we have some movement on the chart? So if we can think about having people move from one quartile up into the next higher quartile to give a healthier distribution, then that will help you fund your mission better. So on the right-hand column of the chart, you have the ideal number of households. And again, we're not expecting there to be 25% of the households in each category. We have 10% in the first quartile, 15 in the second, 35 in the third, and 40% in the fourth. So we have that on there as a way to, a goal to achieve. There are some congregations that actually do get that type of distribution. And it helps you be more stable because if somebody in your top quartile leaves or moves away or passes away, then that can provide a big financial hit to your congregation. So trying for a good distribution is better. So if we can have movement from the bottom quartiles up into the higher quartiles or the second quartile up into the first quartile, that would be great. All right, so here is another way to look at things. You can have a pledge table with ranges. So many of you have done an annual budget drive or even a capital campaign where you had, this is the number of gifts that we need to reach our goal. So this is just a sample of educating your congregation about where the distribution lies. So this is not disclosing at all who's in each giving category, but people are looking at this and saying, wow, I didn't know there was a household that was giving $11,000. And I didn't know there were 20 households in our fellowship that were giving between $1,000 and $24.99. So it does help for people to see what other people are giving, not knowing who they are, but what the distribution of pledges are. And then if you want to reach a particular fundraising goal, What is it going to take to get us there? How many do we need in each category? Again, you can use this pledge table to say, gee, can you find yourself in a particular pledge range category, and think about in the next year or two, trying to move up into the next category of pledges. Mallory says we did a pyramid chart of the previous year's giving last year, and it was successful. Lots of positive feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
I think we used it once. I think I was still going to comment, make a comment on that too. We used this in Ventura, and I think we had a theme of like moving up or something, and really challenged people to get to another level of giving. You know, I think we so often come from a place of scarcity about how much money is there, really. In Ventura, we figured our average income was probably higher than the city's average income. Now, that may or may not be true in your congregation. But looking around, we knew we'd had a very active ministry to people who are homeless. We had a lot of people, some people who were indigent, who were part of our congregation, and on disability. And that was their sole income. But we still looked at our overall congregation and thought, we're at least the average pledge, the average income in Ventura. So we did a little experiment, and we got that average income. We times it by the number of pledging units in the congregation. And then we took 10% of that, which is what we would have if people gave 10%. So our budget at the time was probably around $300,000 a year. Anybody want to guess how much more in income we would have had if everyone in the congregation earned only the average, you know, that our average was the city's average, and gave 10%? I'd be happy to see your guesses about how much that would have increased our $300,000 budget. Okay, Brian says it would have doubled. All right, we would have had an extra 300,000. Double, another person 300,000. 5 to 10 times. Now you're talking. We would have had about another $800,000 in income, given that. So that also can be kind of eye-opening. And I think some of these other tables may be less threatening initially, but they still give people an idea about the range of giving in a congregation and where they fit. And I think that's really important.
All right, so looking at electronic giving options, there's lots of different ways that people give today and pay for things. The first one is electronic funds transfer, and ACH, or automatic clearinghouse, is what that stands for. It's not important, but a lot of people like to call it ACH, via Vanco or some other service. So Vanco is a service that a lot of our UU congregations use to do electronic funds transfer. This is an easy way for folks to say, I'm going to be giving $250 a month, and that's going to happen either on the 1st or the 15th of the month. You can pick the day. You can do it twice a month. You can do it once a month. Whatever you decide you want to do as a congregation, then that money provides a streamlined flow of cash for the congregation. The congregant doesn't have to think about writing a check every month. They might decide they still like to write checks. But if they want this streamlined way of giving, this is a great way to do it. So this is different than you saying with your bank, I'm going to initiate my bank to send a check to the congregation every month. This is something that you authorize the congregation to do. They're only authorized to take the amount that you say is okay. They can stop it immediately at any time on one day's notice. And it's a great way to have giving be fairly seamless and, again, provide some continuity. Credit cards are another way, very popular way for people to give. They get airline miles, other types of benefits with that, and it's becoming increasingly popular. There are some studies that show that people give more when they can give by credit cards, and I'll let you decide whether you think that's causes any sort of ethics issue for you or not. But a lot of people want to be able to give with their credit card. It's easy to be able to do that. You can provide a little box where they're donating a little extra amount to help cover the credit card fees, because sometimes those can be pricey and add up. Website giving options are another way. Many congregations have ways to donate online. So some of them use PayPal, other congregations use other types of services, but having that option is important. It's a common way to give these days, and it's a good thing to set up if you don't have that yet. QR codes are the little codes that you see on a lot of products that you can scan and give. That's a way that some congregations are starting to give now. Giving by text is another way. So there's several different types of ways to do that. One of them is called Give by Text. That's through Vanco. So if you have a Vanco thing already set up, then you have a little app on your phone. You can do a text message and you can give, whether it's for a one-time fundraiser or whether it's what you're going to do on Sunday. And another one is called Text to Give. That's through Alexio church software. Some of our congregations are using that as well. So funding something, giving by text message is another thing to think about it. Variety is key because, as we know with many things, one size does not fit all. So here's just some examples: giving by credit card, giving through Vanco, giving at your website, and then there's a QR code there as well. So allow your congregation to adapt to these different types of methods once you introduce them. Sometimes congregations try it and they say, well, not enough people are doing it. It takes a little while for people to adjust to change and to see how things are going. So just allow yourself that time for the adaptation. So reasons for giving. Jan, this is your slide.
We wanted to point out that people's motivations for giving are varied, and that's okay. There's not one superior reason for giving. One is they believe in the values and the work of the congregation. We had a woman in Ventura who never stepped foot in the church, and she wrote us a check for $1,000 every year. She was a local businesswoman. She just liked that there was a liberal religious presence in her hometown. And obviously, for a lot of the members, they do. A lot of our members were particularly touched by the fact we gave away every plate. And so the congregation's generosity helped spark theirs. People want to do their fair share. This is very ingrained in a lot of people. I want to carry my own weight. I want to do my fair share. And that's why it's so important to let people know what the expectations are, what the budget amounts to per person, the cost of the congregation, and what other pledging is. They also come to understand generosity as a religious value. That, we talk about 10% as tithing, and it has this aura about it that's negative sometimes. Financial planners recommend you save 10% and you give 10%. That's financial planners, and that's not from a biblical-based financial planning. So people come to understand generosity as a religious value and just as a practice that helps bring happiness. Giving is expected, and they have clear opportunities to bring their time, talent, and treasure, and they're recognized and they're thanked for that. And they feel connected. One of the things that we can never get away from is the importance of personal connections. And as you grow, it's important to maintain those personal connections. People give to people. Is something that's talked about a lot in the giving world. Here's a myth. You're going to just grow and then your money problems will be over. It doesn't work like that. Large congregations have additional expenses and sometimes even more so in terms of the growth. So you're not going to grow your way out of money problems. And fundraising without personal connections is much less successful. Here's the most important one: the power of personal stories. And I'm going to invite, if there's someone here tonight, to unmute or put in the chat a way in which your congregation has changed your life. I did this at Russell Lockwood Leadership School, and a young adult stood up and said, "This congregation saved my life." At a very difficult time in my life, I walked into a Unitarian Universalist congregation. I saw a quote that spoke to me. Not only did the congregation save my life, it saved my marriage. And I've been a Unitarian Universalist now for over a decade. And those are the kinds of stories that we know exists, and maybe they do here tonight. And if there's anyone here who's willing to share one of those, we would be willing to hear it.
I'll jump in while people are thinking and tell you about, as a UU myself and my own congregation, there's been lots of times people have stood up in front of the congregation and talked about how the congregation has changed their life. And one of the many meaningful ones that comes to my mind often is one of our transgender youth who the congregation funded to go to a camp for transgender youth, and how it transformed them. And they were so grateful and so happy that we had done that. So it's not about someone standing up and saying, "I'm giving X" necessarily. It's more about what we're accomplishing together, how we're supporting each other and the wider community in living out our values. So that's a story that comes to mind for me. And
I'm reading in the chat, "I joined my congregation when I was in an abusive marriage raising 4 stepchildren. My congregation gave me a village of support when I was isolated, and they carried me through until I could get myself safe physically and emotionally." Thank you for that story. Thank you to that congregation. "My congregation fed my family 3 days a week for a year after my wife died. Their support helped us through our grief."
great.
"It's made me to understand what kind of Unitarian I am, and I can still be a Christian." So we know our congregation saves lives. And these are the stories that as leaders we need to listen for and we need to tell. And remember that slide, for those of you who signed on in time, that talked about, leaders tell the story of their congregation. That's my cat rocking the boat, I'm sorry. These are the stories we can tell. This is the kind of place that changes lives. This is the kind of place that saves lives. And it's worth supporting. So the role of leaders is we can help identify the gifts we and others bring and play to our strengths. We can show leadership in struggling with these issues by doing our own work. We have shame around money. We have guilt around money. We have all of those things. And we, as leaders, can show what it looks like to work through those things and to be honest about it and let ourselves be vulnerable and to say, I'm struggling with this, but I'm going to keep struggling with this. I am not finished. I am growing my own generosity. And I want you to join me in that struggle. And I need your support in that struggle. We can make public pledges to grow our generosity and to be specific about what that means. So I went from a minister who thought before I went into ministry I would never pledge to one that said I would give 10%. I would grow my pledge to get to 10%. And that I would do that over time, and I would do that in an intentional way. we can ask the right questions. I think those are, how can we support one another? How can we walk alongside people? And here are 3 great questions that would be wonderful questions to ask for your board, your stewardship committees, your small groups. Where are the signs of generosity right now in our institution, in our congregation, in our fellowship? How can we participate, encourage, and lift up those signs? How can we do a better job of nurturing that and recognizing that generosity and being grateful for it? And then what else can we do to reframe current practices so that they reflect a more generous spirit? And in congregational life, we talk about going from scarcity to abundance, from fear to faith. So the story in Ventura used to be the myth of Sisyphus. The myth where the guy is rolling the stone up the hill, and then just as he gets it up to the hill, it rolls back down, and then he rolls it back up. That was our narrative. And we had to change that narrative. At one point, I sat in a meeting and someone said, because they were telling the story again, the myth of Sisyphus story, and someone said, yes, we are nothing if not persistent. And everyone just sat up a little different and said, yes, that's our story. We're persistent. We're going to keep getting it done. So reframing our stories, I think, is one of the most important things we can do. We were going to ask for a few ideas about that, but I think we've come close to the end of our time. And so I want to leave questions right now for a little time for this next slide. Kay, you were...
Sure. So you get better with practice. With stewardship, talking about money, same as almost everything else. There's that 10,000 hour standard you probably have heard about in various pieces of literature. So you get comfortable by doing it. So talking about money in your next annual budget drive, what we can accomplish. So this is what we want to do together. Why you support your congregation. You don't have to say how much it is. Why is it important to you? I could list 10 ways why I support my congregation. I feel it's so important place in the world, especially given what the current culture is. Why every gift is important and appreciated. So the personal stories and the conversations are the easiest and they're the most effective. So you can have a conversation with somebody about why the church is meaningful to you, how it has impacted your life, why you are moved by all the lives that your congregation touches and supports. And just talking about that is easy to talk about. It's just telling a personal story. It's not necessarily even having the conversation about money. But I encourage you to do that as well and think about where we get our feelings of scarcity that we have around money. What are our earliest memories of money, and working through that so that we can talk about that and use it as a positive force for good in our congregations.
I want to lift up, too, as another story that Mallory wrote. Our congregation was able to donate almost $10,000 to a longtime member and mother of 2 young children when she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. It was a paddle auction at our annual service auction. Thank you for that story, Mallory.
Oh, very compelling. All right, so questions and takeaways. So unmute yourself to speak, or use the chat feature to type your question.
We got about 3 minutes.
Or list a takeaway or something that you learned. Electronic giving. Someone earlier had mentioned the putting on their pledge card that they're on the giving guide.
It says, how many congregations don't have a minister building and are lay-led? QR codes. Practice until we can talk about money without embarrassment. Use of database. Did you mention earlier a UU course on money? Yes, we did, and we'll show that in the resources as we end here, and I will also be sending you those links.
So here are the links, and the one that's the UU course on money is the third one listed here. It's the Wisdom Path, so it's under tapestry/adults/wisdom there, and all of these resources I would encourage you to look at, and you can see a variety of different tools that might be helpful to you.
And it's saying telling the story, personal stories are the most effective. Will we get access to the slides without the recorded discussion? I'm not sure about that, but you will get a link to the webinar, and we will send you these links. How to better use the Fair Share Guide for more effective results. Adding heart to the pledge campaign. It is all about heart. Every bit of it. It's about your story. It's about what is possible. It's about lives being changed. And the rest those are techniques. Those are the technical things, and they matter. But what matters most is the heart. Keeping the message positive. Yes. So easy to say, you know, we lack this, we lack that, we don't have enough for this, we've got to have some money so we can fix the furnace, we don't have enough. And being able to change that language is really important. Here's what we can do. We can have safe space. We can create safe space. We can be fair with our staff. We can be generous. So in closing, we use these words from Eric Walker Wickstrom. We grow through encounters with the unknown, however hard that may be for us, because these encounters have many gifts to offer. So may you go forth from here, not who you were, but who you could be. Thank you, each and every one of you, for joining us tonight from all over the Pacific Western region. Together we are so much better. You will be hearing from me, and I will be sending out a link for an evaluation, because we're always looking at how we can do things better. And it'll also give you some of this information.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And
also, let me say one last thing. All of you have primary contacts for your congregation. If you've got questions and you want to explore some of those more about stewardship, they're your first person to contact. And then they may put you in touch with me. They may put you in touch with Kay. Give them a call. We are here, and we want to feed the help in our congregations. And we know there's a lot of it out there. Take good care.